Good evening, everyone. Thank you for making time this evening to participate in the second of public forums looking at the future policy changes at the City of Fargo with special assessments. My name is Tony Grinberg. I'm City Commissioner. With me tonight is Mayor Tim Mahoney. Commissioner Gehrig is also a member of the task force, and he was unable to be with us tonight. I'm going to kind of deviate from my slide order and go right to continued introductions. First, I'd like to have the city staff that lead our various departments stand up and just be acknowledged for their fine work and dedication to making our city a better place. I can tell you, for somebody who's been on the commission now for 3 years, it's been a pleasure to work with such talented people who make the city work and respond to citizen input and need and make our community a great place. Welcome, former Commissioner Arlette Preston. Couldn't help myself, Arlette. So I would like to have those members of the task force that began the work last August to stand up and just recognize or introduce themselves, one by one. You get a little play time here.
Don Dabbert, Custom Homes, representing the Econ Home Builders.
Curtis Grosky, living in North Park. I am Kevin Hansen, Kansas City Bank, and I represent the mortgage lending industry.
I'm Gloria Connor from Beyond Realty, and I represent the Fargo Moorhead Association of Realtors.
I'm John Cosgrove, former city commissioner that somehow screwed up and got the special assessments wrong in 2004, so they put me back on this task force.
I'm Jeff Wolk with Moore Engineering, representing the Fargo Moorhead Chamber. Fargo Moorhead West Fargo. Sorry, Mayor.
Yeah. Just about got it back in the head. Bernie Dardis, the City of West Fargo Mayor, ex-official member.
And I'd like Blake Crosby to stand and introduce himself as well.
Thank you. I'm Blake Crosby, Executive Director of the North Dakota League of Cities.
Wonderful. Last August, as I said, Tuesday night, last August, when we came together as a task force, I asked the members of the task force to raise their hands if they are currently paying specials. And I think every hand went up at the time when we kicked off this task force. So I'd ask those in the audience tonight that are here to learn more and provide input, how many in the room currently are paying special assessments? Okay, so just about everybody, okay. Tonight's agenda is pretty straightforward. Welcome and background on the task force. We're going to have Mr. John Shockley, who is a attorney who has provided counsel to many local political subdivisions, as well as was part of our early meetings last fall to share the background and legal side of special assessments and what is dictated by North Dakota Century Code. And then we've asked John Cosgrove, as a member of the task force as well, to provide an update, an overview of the task force rankings and a culmination of the discussions that were held last summer, late last summer and fall, and what the task force ranked earlier this year. And then we're going to go into the public comment period and have your feedback. And then ultimately what's going to happen after tonight is that from Tuesday night's input and the additional information we received online through our website and our Facebook will be cataloged with the feedback from tonight. And then that information and those ideas will be aligned with the task force. And then our full report will be available sometime in early July, we anticipate. And then that step forward will be brought to the City Commission with recommendations on changes to the policy for the special assessments. I would like to run through, just to give you a sense of the topics covered that started last August. And let me just share those in high-level brief form. And this information is also available on the city website. But when we kicked off last August on the 28th, comments and concerns from the task force range from economic effects of specials on homeowners in established neighborhoods, housing costs and affordability, fairness and concerns for defining benefit in neighborhoods, economic effects on business, the whole notification process and transparency, and the escalating costs around infrastructure, concrete, labor, pipes, so forth. On September 6th, then we heard from Mr. Shockley, provided an overview of the legal background and the methods that are, kind of guided by the Century Code in North Dakota for how cities operate. And then at the end of September, we had a presentation from Mr. Kent Costin, who provided in-depth overview of how the city of Fargo conducts its business with special assessments and finance. And then in early October, Gloria Palm Connor, a member of the task force, and Don Dabbert respectively described impacts on housing from a national and a local area and economic trends. And we also heard from Bismarck City Administrator Keith Hunke, who presented an overview of what Bismarck was proceeding and trying to accomplish with changes to special assessments and how things would be paid for in the city of Bismarck. And then in November, we largely had a discussion that really aligned the future steps of the task force, that everyone is in agreement that greenfield development or new development would be treated as one category, and then the existing neighborhoods where we would go in and modernize infrastructure, new streets, water and sewer, was the other category that the task force agreed to. And then in January or February, I think it was February, we came together after 6 weeks of assembling all the information and then asked the task force to rank in area priority, which Mr. Cosgriff will talk about later. One of the additional areas that I'd like to emphasize that you're going to hear more about from Mayor Mahoney when he wraps up the session here is, to quote Bruce Grubb from last summer, when former Representative Al Carlson, House Majority Leader, and Senator Rich Wardner were in Fargo and announced the legislation that would now be tagged as the Prairie Dog legislation, that would in essence bring oil revenue and oil proceeds that have largely been invested in infrastructure and taking care of the West with high demand, high growth, would now be time to spread that wealth across the state. And so it's important to recognize as we share this information tonight, as well as look at the impact that's going to have on special assessments and bringing down the burden even more because state resources will be coming in. It's important to recognize that the work of the legislature made that happen. And so as you go about your travels, if you know legislators, give them a big thanks because it's a profound change. It will reduce costs to taxpayers. I think north of $25 million will come to Cass County per year. And in the case of Fargo, we will have about $25 million a biennium, 12 or 13 million a year. It's coming in to help buy down the cost of specials on our decisions as we improve and modernize infrastructure in the city of Fargo. So, the scope of work. This is what the City Commission aligned as a scope of work for the task force. It was to review the history of special assessments, to include current and past funding methodology for greenfield development or new development, and upgrade the City of Fargo existing infrastructure, streets, arterials, public safety, water, and sewer. And the task force will also research and review and recommend innovative financing options to include the elimination of current voter-approved sales tax, special assessment funding, and or replacing it with other financing options. So that's kind of a backdrop in the work. We are pleased to be here tonight to share this information with you. And I think it's also important to footnote that a year ago, a little over a year ago, through citizen feedback, the City Commission made a decision to amend the policy that was presently, or a year ago, at 50-50 cost share, where 50% of the cost of an improvement in existing neighborhoods in particular was borne by the homeowner. And that really created some unfair burden, particularly in the North Broadway project. And so the action of the City Commission a year ago changed that back to a 2016 policy of 70% sales tax and other local means, and 30% to the homeowner. And so this chart gives you an illustration of 3 examples of homes in Fargo under the old policy a year ago, and then what we changed moving forward last summer. So it gives you a perspective of how those costs were decreased because of that decision. What you're going to learn tonight is by bringing that Prairie Dog funding in, you're going to see that even drop further in cost and impact and savings to the homeowner. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Shockley. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is John Shockley, and thank you for coming to tonight's forum. Just a little bit of my own background. I'm a shareholder at Onstead Twitchell, and I do specialize in municipal government, really with a focus on public infrastructure and public finance. I spend a lot of time representing political subdivisions and developers dealing with special assessments, development deals, and other types of transactions in the public sphere. I always have to give a disclaimer when I make these types of presentations. I'm not here representing any particular party. I'm not here to provide you any policy or any personal initiative. This is just to provide some background information. Feel free to ask questions. Once again, I'm not here for a specific policy, just providing some information. So a lot of times I get asked, where did special assessments come from? And I spent quite a bit of time researching the history of special assessments, and the farthest back that I could find the existence of a special assessment dates all the way back to the 13th century in England. And special assessments really followed the English common law into the United States. I found case law that dated back to 1691 from before the founding of the United States, in which the colony of New York was levying assessments. The oldest assessments date back to the draining of swamps and other types of features that were considered public health, and the governing entity was trying to determine the best way to pay for the project and how do you allocate the benefits out. I also have had a lot of questions throughout my career about the prevalence of special assessments throughout the country. Just a broad scope of research regarding different states. All of the states have some form of special assessment that has, it could not necessarily be used by cities, but they usually have a political subdivision that has some ability to levy special assessments. That's not to say that they choose to use that authority, but they do have that authority. I think that dates back to common law roots, that there's some option. Is this a little better? There's usually some option for the political subdivision to levy a special assessment. And so what is a special assessment? A special assessment is a benefit that is levied against a property, and the benefit is determined by the political subdivision, and the assessment itself is the cost that is associated with that benefit. In general, under the United States Constitution and most state constitutions, the assessment can't exceed the benefit. And so oftentimes you'll hear people will say, well, does it benefit my property? Doesn't it benefit my property? That's why there's just a generic test under the Constitution that was announced by the Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court years ago, that the benefit or the assessment cannot exceed the benefit. So how about special assessment history in North Dakota itself? In the research that I've done, special assessment legislation dates back to the founding of the state of North Dakota in some format. There's case law back to the 1910s and earlier discussing challenges to special assessments. So in summation, special assessments have been with us for a long time. How those special assessments are utilized really becomes a policy discussion. It's a tool for policymakers to pay for projects. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what the process is, and one of the terms that you'll hear is a Special Assessment Commission. Now, a Special Assessment Commission is a group of individuals that are selected by the governing body of your city. In Fargo, that's the City Commission would select the Special Assessment Commission. In council cities, the council would select the members. Special Assessment Commission, at a minimum, has to have 3 members. They have to be residents of the city. They have 6-year terms, and they're supposed to alternate those terms. Their job is to make the determination of what the benefits are accruing to property for a particular improvement and what the assessments are. They actually make decisions, as compared to a Planning and Zoning Commission that makes recommendations. The Special Assessment Commission actually has the authority to make a decision. And I'm going to back up a little ways to how do we get to the Special Assessment Commission. briefly, there's really two parts that are laid out to the process in the North Dakota Century Code. The first process is the creation of an improvement district, and the second process is the assessment part. And so an improvement district is a decision that's made by the governing body to designate an area within a city for a specific type of improvement. Those improvements are set forth by the Century Code, and they can include streets, water, storm sewer, wastewater, street lights, all sorts of public improvements, sidewalks that you would normally attribute to a city. The city commission or city council makes a determination as to the size of the district, and then receives reports and plans and specs from its engineer regarding what those types of projects should look like, what the estimated costs are. In the case of a water and sewer type of an improvement, they are referred to as non-protestable improvements. That means the public can't protest the creation of the district, but with a street district, they can protest it. Assuming that the district is not protested out, or if it's a water and sewer district, the city's engineer and city auditor and finance staff would then work to bid out the project. It has to be publicly bid, and pursuant to North Dakota law, the governing body is required to accept the lowest responsible bid for the project. And so rest assured that when the project is being undertaken with the special assessment, it is utilizing the lowest responsible bidder. So it's a competitive bidding process. The city just can't go out and select a certain contractor that it likes. It actually has to bid out the process. Once the project is complete or nearly complete, the costs are certified by the auditor or the city's financial team, and that starts the special assessment process. The city's financial team, along with their city engineer, possibly their city attorney, will then meet and make a determination of what, along with the Special Assessment Commission, those benefits for the improvement are and what the assessment should be. The Special Assessment Commission then is required by law to publish notice of the list of the proposed assessments in the official newspaper of the city. Now, that's the minimum required by law. Cities can certainly go above and beyond that. They can certainly send out additional notices to property owners regarding the process, but the Century Code only sets forth a minimum requirement. Cities can choose to, due to transparency requests by commissions or councils, they can go above and beyond that and add additional notice requirements in. The Special Assessment Commission then meets in a public hearing where residents that are proposed to be assessed can appear and they can protest their assessment. And that protest can include, you have the wrong lot, the assessment's too much, whatever type of protest one resident may or may not have regarding their particular property. The Special Assessment Commission then hears and makes a determination regarding those protests and makes its decision. If the property owner is not happy with the decision of the Special Assessment Commission, they can then appeal that determination to the governing body of the city. And the city's governing body, whether that's a commission form of government or a city council form of government, then hears those appeals. Those appeals have to be in writing and they have to be submitted to the governing board. It's not sufficient under North Dakota case law just to make a verbal objection to the city commission. It must be in writing. The city commission then makes a determination of whether that objection is valid or if they agree with it or disagree with the objection. And if the property owner is still not satisfied with the decision of the governing body, then they can appeal it to a district court. And that appeal to the district court is not a trial in the sense that you see on TV where you call witnesses and it takes weeks on end to have the trial. It's on the record, based upon the record that the city has, and it's briefs that are submitted by the party's attorneys. And then the judge will make a decision on that appeal and ultimately either confirm or the assessment, or the judge may send it back to the political subdivision to re-levy the special assessment. And once again, that's just a brief overview. I went into much greater detail in my presentation that I gave to the Special Assessment Task Force. If you're interested in a lot of the details, my understanding is that presentation is available on video, as are the materials that were provided at the meeting. Special assessments are really governed by the Century Code and also by case law interpreting that Century Code. There are really three main methods of special assessments in North Dakota. And it really is dictated by the type of improvement that is proposed to be assessed. The first type of improvement that would normally be assessed would be a street, and streets are normally assessed on a front footage basis. And the North Dakota Supreme Court has held that that's an appropriate way to specially assess a street project. So that means if you have a residential lot with 100 front foot, you'll receive an assessment that's based upon a calculation per linear foot and multiplied by the amount of feet on your lot. There are some policy distinctions about that you may run into regarding lots that are in cul-de-sacs or corner lots. Those are the sorts of issues that the Special Assessment Commission has to wrestle with. What's the appropriate amount of benefit for those types of lots? The second type of assessment is an area assessment. These are most commonly seen with a stormwater assessment in which the collection of stormwater is based upon square footage. The theory behind this type of assessment is that it rains equally upon property, and land that is draining should be assessed based upon a square foot basis. The third type of assessment is an equivalent unit. Most of the time we see these types of assessments with a water or sewer hookup, where the house has one water or one sewer hookup. We'll also see these types of assessments where you have collector streets or much larger area-wide projects where you'll have both a local assessment for the street, for the property abutting the street, and then you have an equivalent unit for the properties that are farther away from the street. The theory being that those properties do receive a benefit from the improvement, but they account for an equivalent unit on those properties. Larger cities in North Dakota are required by state law to have their assessment policy in writing. And so most cities, if you ask them for their assessment policy, will provide you a copy of their assessment policy. The length of time for the length of time for an assessment in North Dakota can go up to 30 years for cities. Most cities, in my experience, in the local area for new developments are assessing on a 25-year basis. And what that means is the Special Assessment Commission will assess your lot a principal amount of $1,000, and that'll be payable over a period of 25 years. So it's $1,000 amortized over 25 years with the applicable interest rate. The interest rate is based upon the debt obligation that is sold by the city to fund those improvements. When a city goes ahead and constructs a street project or reconstruction project of a street, oftentimes cities will sell bonds to fund those types of improvements. The city goes out and sells the bonds in a competitive marketplace at a tax-exempt interest rate. Those interest rates are currently ranging anywhere from 3.5% to 4.5%, depending upon the city. By Century Code, a city can add 1.5% to that interest rate to charge the property owners. That determination of whether it should be a 0.5% or 1.5% is a policy decision for the city. You may ask, why would they charge additional dollars for that? The reason is, if a property defaults and doesn't pay its special assessments, there has to be some additional funds for the city to continue making a debt service. Because if the property owners aren't paying the special assessments, the city still has to make its debt payments on the bonds. It also accounts for those properties that might prepay assessments. So when you prepay an assessment, the city never collects any interest from the assessment, and at the same time it's required to pay interest on the debt that it borrowed. And so it helps prevent those types of shortages. And finally, for if there are any types of defaults or late payments where people are waiting 2 or 3 years to make a payment on their special assessments. For a while in one of the communities I had that I was representing, we had many property owners, developers that would wait a couple of years before they build a house, wouldn't pay the special assessments, and when they sold the house, then they would pay all the special assessments. And so that's the reason why the Century Code allows that additional interest rate to be charged. Special assessment bonds, you'll hear that terminology used often. those are the types of bonds that are sold to fund these improvements that are financed with special assessments. They're technically known as refunding improvement bonds, but I think they're commonly referred to as special assessment bonds. As Commissioner Grinberg said, there are really two major areas of assessments that we see locally. The first is greenfields. The best example of that would be a brand new housing development in South Fargo, where you start out with vacant land. There are no houses out there, there's no roads, there's no infrastructure. And these types of improvements really consist of a new road, oversized regional infrastructure, which is sending the pipes out to service these areas, and any type of new development. The second major area is reconstruction. So in the older parts of town or in your downtown area where you're reconstructing streets, you have to go ahead, order the improvement, create the district, and propose to assess those. So briefly at the task force meetings, I went over some of the issues that are associated with greenfields. There was a lot of dialogue regarding, do we want to have special assessments for new developments, or do we want to have developers fund those? And so I spent a lot of time thinking through these issues, and I've worked on both sides. I've worked for both developers and cities, so I have a view that when I speak of advantages and disadvantages, it's for policymakers to decide which one is best for the specific community. And so the model that we mostly see in the metro area is where the cities will use special assessments to fund local infrastructure. And the advantages to a city are that the city will control the engineering of the project and the construction management and oversight. And what that means is the city's engineer gets to oversee what types of improvements go in the ground, make sure the pipes are the right size, make sure the lift stations work, and also make sure that the quality of the construction is up to city standards. Because keep in mind, no matter who constructs the underground pipe, at some point in time, the city staff is going to have to take over and maintain and operate that pipe. An advantage is that the developer does not have carrying costs. And I understand that might seem like kind of counterintuitive. Why do we care about that? Some developers don't have sufficient capital to capitalize a large development. With the cost of infrastructure increasing as fast as it is, it's not unusual to see a development of a new residential development in the neighborhood of $3 to $6 million of infrastructure. That becomes very difficult for most developers to carry those costs or to finance them. And so making developers fund all of the infrastructure themselves could serve as a barrier to the market, which would mean that there would be less lots available and less growth for a community. And so one of the advantages is, in fact, growth. There's an opportunity for more development and smaller developers to enter your marketplace. Oftentimes around the country, many cities are struggling with how do we fund growth, how do we fund development, what is the revenue source for a new street, a new transportation system, because their current infrastructure needs can't handle the growth. And so special assessments provide a revenue source and an ability to fund that growth and control it. The city has the ability to control its risks by requiring a letter of credit from the developer. What is a letter of credit? Most cities in the area require developers to provide some sort of security that they will pay the assessments until a house is constructed on the lot. A letter of credit is issued by a bank, usually a local bank, and if the developer is in violation of their development agreement with the city can draw upon the letter of credit to make whatever payments are needed or due under the agreement with the city and the developer. What are some of the disadvantages? The city has to issue debt. The refunding improvement bonds are a debt obligation of the city. In the event of default, the city still has to pay them. So if the developer doesn't pay the special assessments or the development isn't successful, the city is still paying on the improvement bonds. It requires the city to have security in the event of a default. This is administrative costs, so the city is chasing down how do we secure ourselves to make sure that the special assessment payments get made. And it also requires administration of the project. And the administration of the project is the city staff time, city engineering time, making sure that the project is going smoothly, it's being constructed properly, those sorts of issues, and potential market distortions. Some people have argued that with special assessments, it distorts the cost of lots because the homeowner doesn't necessarily have to borrow all the money for the lot, so they get a mortgage for the lot, less the specials. They're able to buy a lot that they wouldn't necessarily be able to afford otherwise, and some have said that causes market distortions. In general, in this area, and I can say in my experience with the three major communities, most greenfield developments are 100% assessed to the property owner. This means all of the improvements within the greenfield, streets, water, sewer, lights, are 100% assessed to each lot. And most of these assessments are 25 years in duration. When I first started doing this, most of the assessments were at 15 years or maybe 20 years in duration, but just simply the cost of the improvements have increased exponentially over time, leading to longer terms to make it easier, longer assessment terms to make it easier for property owners to pay the specials. So what are the advantages to developer-funded greenfields? The obvious one is that there's no debt issued by the city and no special assessments to homeowners. Traditionally, the developer has lower engineering costs. They're usually able to negotiate with the engineering firm to provide a lower cost of engineering fees. That's not always true, but that's been my experience, that it's slightly lower, and we're only talking a few percentage points. We're not talking significant dollar savings. The developer is not required to follow public bidding laws, so if the developer has a great relationship with a specific contractor and can negotiate a really low price, he or she, the developer, may get a better deal than the public would publicly bidding it. That can also work the reverse. Maybe there's an ongoing relationship between a certain contractor and a developer, and that contractor has higher fees than what would be obtained through the public bidding requirement. Also, developers aren't required to post payment or performance bonds for their own work. What a payment and performance bond is it's a requirement under contracts that are let by cities for construction of infrastructure. A payment bond is in place so that if a subcontractor or a material supplier brings materials to the work site and the general contractor doesn't pay, they can make a claim against the payment bond. And a performance bond is in place to assure that the contractor is able to finish the construction project. Those are typically adding 1 to 1.5% cost to the construction bid. So once again, we're not talking huge savings, but it is a slight savings. What are the disadvantages? It's really loss of control over the design by the city. You may say, why is that a big deal? It's a big deal because sometimes the infrastructure doesn't match up. The city has to eventually take over operations and maintenance of the infrastructure, and if it's not installed properly, it ends up costing the city more in the long run because the city didn't oversee the installation originally. And typically what I've seen is most cities will require, when the developer installs the infrastructure themselves, they'll hire an engineering firm to oversee the installation of that construction. And so you already have additional costs layered on. Some of the other disadvantages are we've seen during the last major economic recession out of Minneapolis that many of the suburbs utilize developer-funded developments. When the development fails, the developer is gone. They're usually a special purpose entity, LLC, or a corporate entity. They're underfunded. They go bankrupt and they leave. And then the banks are fighting over the lots, and there's tumbleweeds blowing down the roads and a few houses in the development. And all of the residents out there look to the city to take over a development that the city had very little control over the installation of the improvement. Once again, it's a disadvantage in that most developers don't have sufficient capital to build a large development or even a smaller development. So that can lead to less lots and higher prices. My experience, developers are generally risk adverse. When they have to start putting a large amount of money on the line, they'll form a specific LLC or some other type of entity to mitigate the risk. That's driven a lot by their financial institutions. City inspections are still required to hand over the infrastructure. Any city that is allowing developers to put infrastructure in the ground themselves generally has a robust inspection program. So they're inspecting the pipe that goes in the ground, they're monitoring warranty requirements, and so there's still a lot of administrative costs in having that go on. And really it becomes a discussion item between the city and developer about who's gonna pay for that. And on top of it, you still have the regional construction costs, because the developer is paying for the localized costs, but you still have your regional water and sewer, your regional roads, who's gonna pay for that? So you may still end up with your development. Typically with a private development, all costs are included in the cost of the project. So what are some of the issues with reconstruction? That's the example of reconstruction of a road in an older neighborhood. It can be financially burdensome to levy 100% of the reconstruction costs on existing homeowners or business owners. This is a common theme that we've seen throughout different cities, is that it's very expensive for especially older parts of town to pay 100% of a reconstruction of the road. My understanding is the city of Fargo has an infrastructure funding policy so that it can buy down that cost. That is based upon the city of Fargo using additional revenue sources such as internal, which are sales taxes and utility revenues, and external when available, that's federal and state grants. However, federal and state grants don't amount to a lot for a larger city, and just overall they're very competitive. And oftentimes they have legal restrictions. And I can certainly stick around and answer any questions. Once again, I tried to give just a brief overview of the presentation that was given to the Special Assessment Task Force.
Thank you, John.
I talk with my hands. I can't use a microphone and a clicker at the same time. Good evening. I'm John Cosgriff. The task force members that don't sit by me anymore, I've been selected to give the findings of our about 10 meetings over 8-9 months. So what you just got here in about a half hour, it took us much longer to get there. And so what I want to present is the consensus of this group. By far, it's not the unanimous decision. There was disagreement and different feelings as we went through this. But before I start, how many like special assessments? Just the two of us. And I want to thank you, because it's moving day tomorrow at our house, and I was supposed to be home packing boxes tonight, so if we can stretch this out, I would really appreciate it. So I'll be done in 2 to 3 hours. But as we look at this, there was 4 main things that we came away as a task force with, and some of those won't be very popular. The first one is that we have to pay for infrastructure. We all benefit from infrastructure, but we really largely ignore it. When's the last time you went out and priced 100 feet of curb and gutter for the front of your house? It's not an exciting thing to do. So as we went through this, this was prior to what you'll hear tonight, the Prairie Dog Fund, which is going to provide some additional relief and ways to finance special assessments. But the first sort of overarching thing is we felt special assessment should be continued in some manner. Not very popular, but the second one is we should find a way to reduce the cost of special assessments. And the government only has one revenue source. It's you, it's me. So when we look at this, we can look at other taxes, but we still have to figure out a way that we're going to pay this. So some way to reduce it. The third thing was how to distribute savings. And if you get into the mysterious world of public finance, Kent Costin here, our city finance director, can tell you it's not as straightforward as going to a bank and borrowing money. There's a lot of things that happen within municipal finance, and it creates different outcomes. So One of the things we said is that we should find a way to work those savings back in or back to the special assessed property owners. And the fourth one, and this is one that we always fight with, is transparency and communication. I think the biggest problem with special assessments is they should be called surprise assessments. Everybody, when they get a special assessment, if it's $28, nobody's really, that's no big deal. It is when it's a major reconstruction or in a new development where all of a sudden you've been paying special assessments and there's additional new ones that come on board. And so one of the things we think that would really help is transparency and better communication in that process. Yep. So the first one, if we look at specifically how we got to special assessments could be continued in some manner. It's just a way to assess those costs, and we each have to share in those. There's just no way around it. We think that special assessment should continue to be used in both greenfield development and reconstruction. Reconstruction almost demands special assessments or some other form, but the controversial one would probably be new sewer and paving, but we think that creates a great situation for the city. And the third one, and this is one that personally scares me, is that when Commissioner Preston and I were both on the City Commission, we'd gone through a period of deferred maintenance, and we were repairing water main breaks every winter to the tune of 250 to 300 water main breaks. And it was really, really frustrating to the neighborhoods, is that when they repair a water main break, they go in and they patch maybe a 1 or 2 foot piece of the water main. And then they put everything back, and you've got a terrible road all winter. Well, 2 weeks later, a foot away from that, the pipe could break again, so then they'd come back and redo the same thing, but a different water main break. We got very aggressive in the late 90s, early 2000s in replacing water main. And so one of the answers we don't believe we want to pursue is deferring or reducing maintenance. That's something that we think is really going to be a problem for us. The second one is how do we reduce special assessment costs? And again, this was done prior to the Prairie Dog funding. Prairie Dog funding is going to be some state funding that we can apply to special assessments. But as we looked at it, we said there's a potential, since most of the special assessments have something to do with a utility. Could we increase utility fees to offset the impact of the special assessment? Could we, and this isn't popular either, could we increase the water rates or the sewage rates, or could we impose a street utility tax and use that to offset special assessments? But again, the street utility tax, I think Commissioner, the legislature said that's a really bad idea and you can't do it.
Now they're going to study it.
They're going to study it, so we have to quick do that before they study it too long. The one thing, and this gets a little bit technical, for new development and with our floodplains and everything changing within the developments, the city has started special assessing the cost of LOMAR, or letter of map revision, and this is simply changing the elevations, the flood elevations of the property. What we decided on that is maybe that is a developer cost, and that's one way we could maybe shift that. And then the last one is the city should reduce the amount of charges for engineering and administration. This is a difficult thing to do, is that these fees do pay for city services and things that we do, but can we find a way to be more efficient and reduce those? So those were the ideas on how to reduce. The third area is, and this one will be problematic, is distributing savings from residual balances of special assessment funds. if your eyes were glazing over, and I apologize, John, for picking on you, as we talked about the history of special assessments, you want to go absolutely comatose, we'll go through bond financing models that'll drive you crazy. But there are times when we do have residual balances left over in a special assessment financing district. And so what we're suggesting is to find a way to try and pass on interest savings through that bonding, that public finance, to the participants in the project. And Kent, I know that's going to keep you awake at night, but I know you can find a way to do it. The second part is sometimes we do have districts that pay off early, and that we would find a way to move those balances back in a rebate form to the property owners. And the final one is what happens currently is at the end of a special assessment financing district, there's sometimes a balance there. And the practice of the city has been to take that balance and transfer it to the general fund. And we're thinking as special assessments become more and more of a problem, we should probably not do that. Now that's going to leave a hole for our elected officials over here in the general fund where they won't have those funds, but that's for them to deal with. They'll have to figure out how to work with that. And then finally, the fourth area is, again, how do we improve transparency? How do we improve the communication? Meetings like this tonight are great. Most people don't care about special assessments other than the amount that's on the bottom of the statement and how you get there. So education is all part of this. As I said, special assessments oftentimes become a surprise. So the first recommendation from the task force is for the city to anticipate and develop a longer capital improvement plan. And again, this is going to put more burden back onto the citizens, but with a longer-term capital improvement plan, you can start to see where special assessments or infrastructure projects are going to be coming up and have a direct impact on your property and how that will happen. What we came up with in the Greenfields is we've gone through a tremendous period of wild growth in western North Dakota, the oil boom out there. There were a lot of contractors that moved west with demand. It created, some higher prices in this market. And one of the problems we have with Greenfields additions, in this seasonal climate that we live in, most bidding is done in the cold winter months. And typically, if you follow it, underground work, infrastructure work, you get your best prices early in the year. We will do greenfield developments at the request of the developer any time of year. Well, if you're bidding an infrastructure project in the summertime or late spring, where people have already lined up work for the year, or maybe are in the field and behind, prices tend to go up. So this is kind of a nuanced little thing, but that if we're going to do greenfields, we've got to do them on a schedule where we've got adequate time for bids. Anything we can do in the bidding process that can improve it or get us better prices, we should do that. And the city should share more information about current and future special assessments. In greenfields, how many of you have ever lived in a brand new development? Didn't you love how that went? You moved in, you knew what your special assessment was, and then about a year later, you got a little love letter from the city and said, guess what, we're putting in a sidewalk. We're gonna hit you with a little bit more. And then another year goes by and they put in street lights, and you're thinking, okay, we're just about done here, and you're getting that under control. And then in the third or fourth year, they put the final wear course on the street. And all these things you thought you'd paid for on the front end kind of sneak up on you. And that's just, again, better information about your current specials and your future specials. That's our results.
Thank you, John. So now we'd like to move into the public comment period. Does everybody have a handout with a series of questions and outline that talk about thoughts and opinions and suggestions around those 5 categories? Now I have some copies up front. And just as a reminder, you can share your information online. Here tonight, we'd ask that you come to those microphones so we can get it recorded properly. And we'll proceed. Any questions? So, judging by the information on your handout, we'd love to hear your feedback on new development greenfield. The developers who wish to be paying for this infrastructure. Your thoughts, your ideas?
Can we put slides, can we just go back to slide 11?
Slide 11.
I'm Brad Schaefer. I don't know what the format is, Tony, but I've lived in several different places, and Fargo does something here that I've never seen done before that just baffles me, and that's the way they do the greenfield. I don't understand really why Fargo chooses to be the bank in this situation, but they shouldn't. And as I'm looking at this, the advantages of this, the city controls engineering, construction management, and oversight. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the engineering department can do that. Is that correct? You can review plats, same way planning and zoning, so you can control the size of the lots, size of streets, and everything. Developer don't have to have carrying cost. I think that's why it exists. To be honest with you, I think that's why this program exists, because the developers pushed for it back when there was less development than there is now. Growth is going to happen once the diversion is built and that south ring is established and the dry area is established. You think Horace and West Fargo are busy with construction now. There's going to be a land grab down there, and it's going to be developed quickly. As I'm looking at this, I got an 11-year-old here, and if we lived in this area, he would be attending a high school somewhere between Davies and Christine, because there's going to be a school built there, I'm guessing, within the next 5 years. City controls risk by requiring a letter of credit from the developer. Again, why is the city involved in risk at all? Again, it baffles me why it's done this way. Developers are always responsible for 100% of the risk, as a contractor is. So there are no advantages. And again, I'm baffled by the task force coming up with the recommendation when there are no advantages to that method. Thank you.
Any comments from engineering or? Additional comments?
Arlette Preston. It's more of a question. I'm wondering if the task force did any research on correlation between the decreased risk for developers and the size of lots, size of homes. There certainly has been some information that at least I've seen where you take a square mile in an area where it's more densely populated with smaller homes, smaller lots, and compare it to the property value of a square mile in the greenfields where they're larger. And the city, the tax value is less for a square mile in the greenfield. So obviously the cost to the city for other services, whether it be garbage or street cleaning or whatever else, water, is going to be higher in that kind of development. So I'm wondering if there was any research done on whether the market distortions when the city is involved in taking some of the risk out of development, if that creates a change in development behavior.
Great question. We did not spend any time on that particular area. Maybe, I don't want to put Don Dabbert on the line, but maybe from his perspective as a home builder, do you have any additional thoughts on that, or Mayor Mahoney?
I guess from the perspective, what we took a look at would be the overall cost recapture, if you will, by a city. So what the National Association of Home Builders study put out, that the average payback is about 2 years from the time the city has infrastructure in and homes going and permitted, from the time of that revenue recapture between sales tax and everything else. So in terms of what it is, of a repayment or a return on investment, it's 2 years, and then of course perpetual into perpetuity from there. The difference where it comes into play is about those very things that was mentioned earlier about the zoning and the density. Now, density is very subjective to some people. Some people think that some other parts of town are more or less dense than maybe some of the other smaller lots. And actually, when you can take a look at some of the existing neighborhoods of town, it would be very comparable to what we'd be doing in any of our newer densities now. Currently, there have been some developments in town in a segment of about 10 to 15 years where there are much larger lots, maybe in the neighborhood of that 60, 70, 80, and 100-foot lots. The return on investment is less than, because obviously we have less water and garbage and people paying those taxes. However, some of the offsetting to that, it's still based on almost a square footage, what Mr. Shockley touched on before. So in valuation, lot values are essentially more value on a bigger lot than actually a lot that would be a third or fourth size of that. So overall, to have to do the calculation, it kind of works out, but the underlying tone of that whole thing is that the city or municipality does have a payback for any of that upfront to go in there and do that. Now, in terms of the developer having, not to sound self-serving, either having a risk or not risk, it really is still very much a joint venture or joint partnership between the city and the developer, because the city wants to have a successful neighborhood and promote neighborhoods, as much as the developer to promote affordable housing, not just for sale housing, but also for rent and everything else. So in working on other committees and collaborating from around the country, this is really a model that most cities try to strive for. It comes down to a matter of funding who would be paying for those arterials and everything else in terms of an impact fee or anything else. So there are fees paid by either the developer or the citizen in every new development around the country. It's just a matter by which it is called. And when it's an impact fee, that does have to be paid upfront at the time, which requires more out-of-pocket expense to that person, because to that individual for their mortgage, in terms of putting 5, 10, or 20% down, and through all their too. And for every $1,000, the new study just came out, for every $1,000 of a home price increase, it knocks 125,000 people nationwide out. So having to essentially pay for all those improvements up front, in our case, or the Metro case, if it would be $30,000 or $40,000 in specials, you can see how many more people that would knock out of the affordable platform. So, is that?
Gloria, do you have anything to add? And then we'll move on. I think we've covered this one too.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you have anything? Okay. We'll go back to the slide. Yes, please.
Kelly Holland, Remax Legacy. You said that they add an extra 0.5 to 1.5% on to the special assessments above what the bond cost is, and I'm wondering what our average is. Is it 0.5% or is it 1.5%? And I do take issue with that a little bit. And how do the books balance out in relation to how many people default and that cost that is taken, is it actually needed? So
Presently, we're at 1%, but I'll ask Kent maybe to comment further on as finance director.
Maybe we should turn this around this way. Yeah, presently, the state law allows us to do up to 1.5%, and those laws were promulgated years ago as a way to have cushion in those 25 years that we are required to carry that debt. We're obligated to pay our bondholders and guarantee those payments, so that was the reason for this. And years ago, we've researched this back into the 1980s, City of Grand Forks and City of Bismarck ran into some issues with deficiencies. They didn't collect enough money to get these assessments paid, and it became a burden to their city. So they went to the legislature and said, can we raise it to 2% over? And the legislature said, we understand what you're saying, but not so fast. And long story short, they set the law at 1.5% over. Now the city has looked at our books and our payment histories, and we have a very fine payment history here. And so back in 2003, this task force that preceded this went through the same process again. We set it down from 1.5 down to 1, and it's been that way since 2003. So you've asked, you know, has there been any defaults in Fargo? And I think the last default was probably in 1980. It was a long, long time ago when interest rates were high and development was being done at a different environment. So we haven't had any defaults. And yes, there's a surplus that accrues into these funds, but on the other side of that, I think there's a perception that there's like millions of dollars in these funds. It's just like a treasure trove of money. But without getting too deep into the weeds, our prepayment history here is really quite high as well. People don't like to pay interest. People don't like special assessments. A lot of our people, maybe 20-25% of people eventually prepay their specials. So if you issue a 25-year obligation and they prepay in the second or the third year, they just decide, I've had enough, I'm just paying it. We have to sit on that money that's dedicated in that fund, and over the last 10 years, we earned almost nothing on those funds, 0.5% maybe if we were lucky, and now it's up to 2%. So we're sitting, if you're a retiree, you probably understand this concept. If I'm doing a fixed income investment, I'm getting a 0.5% return, but I'm paying 4 to 5% on these bonds. So there's a negative drag on these funds, which causes them, yes, it comes out in the end, there's typically a surplus, but when we ran the averages of this, see if I can remember the numbers, over the last 10 years, I believe if you averaged all those surpluses out, it's about $200,000 a year. And you divide that potentially by 8,000 parcels of the aggregate of all the people that are participating in those funds, it would be about a $25 rebate if they go down the path of this. So there's other economic forces working over that 25-year period, and we are totally responsible. We have 20 to 30 bond issues outstanding at any given time, over $420 million worth of these bonds outstanding, and we do monitor them. We're required to monitor them. We're required to report on them. And so to answer your question, yes, there does accrue a surplus at the end. The issue is, what do you do with it? And the legislature also talked about this years ago, and they just said basically the only fair thing to do is simply move it into the general fund, and that's the way that the laws are currently promulgated, because then everybody benefits equally. If you move it into the general fund and you have the tendency of reducing a burden on a tax increase or property taxes, then they've deemed that to be an appropriate way to make it fair for everybody.
Further comments? And maybe just an add-on, the City of Fargo's annual operating budgets are right around $100 million a year. And property taxes constitute of just under $30 million of that is where it's generated. And the rest of the income that we generate through fees and other sources of income, balance the books to provide services to the city. And if I remember right, one of the points Kent made in your presentation, there is a delta between $1 million and $2 million that makes its way into the general fund every year. And so from a big picture perspective, what goes into the general fund compared to the overall operating budget of the city is pretty small. No other comments on this question? We'll move forward. Second one on your list, cap costs. A moment to read through the background in your handout. And maybe if I can call on Brenda, maybe to give a short overview of what cap costs are and how the city goes about it, or Dan Eberhardt, one of you two, just maybe to help give a little better background. They love it when I call on them when they're not expecting it.
So when we were talking about going back from the 50-50 policy, which is what it was back in 2016. So we had a 2016 policy where we split the cost 50% between the city and the homeowners or business owners for our projects. And so when we resorted back to our older policy, that is incorporating our capped costs. And so by capping these costs, it helps us to easily estimate. So if we know that we're gonna have a project, so if you've got an old infrastructure in front of your house and we know we will be there one day, we can at least tell you what the cap cost is today and give you a very good estimate of what that cost would look like. When we were at the 50-50 percentage, it all was kind of dependent on what the construction costs were at that time. So by having those capped costs of what you will be charged for the project, that really helps us to be able to estimate it. And so well, the amount the property owner is consistent and typically does not change based on the complexity of the project either. So your minimum cost stays the same even if the project cost goes up. And then it doesn't change due to market conditions. So for an example, on a street reconstruction project, the maximum amount or cap on a single family residence that would be charged for the street reconstruction portion is $75 a front foot. So the front foot would be the width of your property, and then the corner properties typically would only pay for one side, and typically the narrowest. So those capped costs keep the cost that is going to the property owner at a steady state, even if the project cost is going up.
Thank you, Brenda. Comments on cap costs? We'll move on to the next, which is reconstruction. Pretty straightforward questions. Thoughts, comments, suggestions? Let me throw another question in. Do you recognize and appreciate the infrastructure enhancements and changes that have been made over the years as a result of the reconstruction efforts, whether it's North University, new streets, your neighborhoods, if you've been impacted? Before we changed the policy last summer, the only feedback I was receiving as a commissioner was that 50-50 cost share. And in general sense, people appreciated the new infrastructure in their existing neighborhoods, but they felt it was unfair what they were being assessed. And that policy change back to 70-30, I believe made a big difference in how people perceived the value and the benefit, if you will, of city redeveloping an existing neighborhood. Just an anecdotal perspective that people have shared with me, but this is important. This is an important question because the voters, in particular, years ago, passed a sales tax for this very purpose. Many of you recall that. It's been in place for many years, And the city has been systematically upgrading the infrastructure, some of the comments that were made about water main breaks, et cetera, to keep ahead of, challenges of decaying infrastructure. So this is important. Your thoughts on that? Should we continue? I think you're going to find that the last slide the mayor talks about is how that cost impact is really going to be, brought down to a very minimum level with the state funds now coming into this portfolio. And let me just add the underlying sentiment from the legislature as well: do not use state funds to subsidize greenfield development. That's pretty much been repeated across the board. So invest these dollars in your aging infrastructure to reduce the impact to taxpayers. Comments? Gonna move along if I don't see any hands. Okay. Again, you can submit your information online or contact one of us. Roadways, arterials. I won't call on Christy again like I did Tuesday, but she's certainly welcome to provide her perspective. This is one of her concerns as a member of the task force. And in fact, I had a coffee day with Commissioner Strand, John Strand, and this is one of the top things on his priority, how we're going to resolve the impact on arterials. And on Tuesday night, there was a gentleman that was really concerned and didn't understand why he was being hit twice by two different arterials. And we did a nice job explaining how that policy or that requirement is in place. But your thoughts on arterials? Dan, do you want to kind of just give an overview on arterials and how we go about it? What I don't want to do is run through these slides without having ample time to think through this and people to ask questions. So.
Good evening. The concept of an arterial is the city has set up, first of all, every parcel in the city of Fargo is affected by one north-south, one east-west arterial. So at any given time, you might have an assessment for one of those. And they're set up on caps also. There's a direct fronting charge. If you directly abut the roadway, you have a direct charge. If you do not directly abut, you have an indirect charge. And that could be, typically in the city of Fargo, it's halfway to the next arterial, the next half mile. And those fees are different. For a direct fronting, currently I believe it's $188 for new construction, and the side, the indirect would be $30 a front foot, meaning you're off the arterial band. And the city has created arterial bands for each one. So those bands are created so that people who live in the Main Avenue band aren't paying for the 32nd Avenue band for their east-west arterials, and the north-south the same way. You might pay for 25th Street band, but you're not paying for University Drive. Any further questions or any questions about that?
Is there a policy that actually exists that explains that?
Yes, there is. You can look up, and it's on the website where you can grab our infrastructure policy. It's actually all spelled out for you there. Or you can contact our office at any time, and we'll be able to explain that to you in further detail.
I have one comment. Jody Schmitz with Remax Legacy. I'm not going to be popular saying this, but I think there are.
Would you like to come up to the?
Oh, I talk pretty loud.
Please come up to the.
Okay. Want me to face this way or that? I'll face this way. Jody Schmitz with Remax Legacy. This isn't going to be popular, I'm sure, but there are arterial roads that I think a lot of people in the city use, like 45th, 13th, 52nd. I live near 52nd. Yes, I use that a lot, but I do think for some of the major roadways by the hospitals, they should be split along the whole city. That's my feeling.
That's why we created these bands. A single-family resident will not pay any more whether you live in the 32nd Avenue band, the 52nd Avenue band, or the Main Avenue, or the North University Drive band. You're capped at that cost. No matter if the price of that construction exceeds the caps, the city funds that portion, but the caps stay the same.
Yeah, what I'm saying is, like, I could live in North Fargo, but I might use 32nd Avenue to go to a hospital, or I might use, 94 roads in the city that a lot of different people use.
Yes. And that's why the arterials are designed for that. But you're paying for your band, they're paying for that arterial. And so you're not paying for all the arterials in town, you're just paying for the arterials that are in that band. Yeah, good point. By statute, we cannot create a citywide special assessment because it's hard to prove benefit off that because of the whole crux of special assessments is benefit to the property. Thank you, John.
And I think that's why when we put the city share into arterials, it's from the sales tax we generate, which is why that contributes to the cost of the arterials, because you're correct, everyone uses it, and that's one way for us to put those monies in that everyone contributes to, and so that's why they go back into the arterials.
Good evening. My name is Dan Dunn, and I happen to be on the Special Assessment Commission, so I'm one of the 3 appointed. I go all the way back to Mayor Furness. He appointed me 22 years ago. And these are terrific questions. Here is what I think gets missed sometimes, and I'll break it down in 2 ways. Number 1, the reason why I believe, and I was one of the 2 that raised their hands with special assessments, is that it's the fairest approach. And here's why. Mike, you should be sitting over there. You're on the wrong side. And that is that I'm paying for what benefits me. All right? The pipe that goes out of my house, I pay for. The pipe that comes into my house, I pay for. The road in front of my house, I pay for. The street light in front of my house, I pay for. Arterials, you bet. I happen to live by Centennial School in South Fargo. So I pay for 25th Street and 40th Avenue. I don't pay anything more. And what's really key about this is, again, it benefits me. So I'm not paying for something way North Fargo, and they aren't paying for me because it benefits me. That's the key to everything that we heard. And John Chalkley did a nice job of summarizing that. This is about benefit. Second thing I'll say is that what, again, sometimes gets lost is the city does everything in its power in order to lessen the cost to the individual property owner. Federal funds, state funds, grants, taxes that the city gets, sales tax, whatever it might be. And so if you have a project that could be $12 million, with those other funds that come in, what's actually assessed sometimes is less than $1 million, because the city does its best in order to tap into those other funds in order to lessen the special assessments that all of us get charged. One other word that I've heard often that is incorrect: this is not a tax. This is not a tax. This is spreading the cost of a particular project. And whatever we do here, we got to pay for it. And so either it's in taxes or it's in utility fees, or it is the benefit for those property owners that actually have access to whatever the service is. So task force did a nice job of studying this, and these are representatives of the entire community. And besides Dan Eberhardt and Doug back there, and maybe the commissioners and perhaps me, these people know more about assessments than they ever thought they would, Christy included. And so they've done a nice job of trying to analyze everything, and I would hope at least that the City Commission listens to their recommendations. Thanks.
And Dan, I think you attended every one of the meetings.
Yes, I did.
And that's another important point to add, that the makeup of the task force is representative of the community. We felt that it was very important that we had a majority of, there were homeowners and home builders, the realtors, mortgage industry. Everybody had a seat at the table, because one specific group shouldn't have the oversight or shouldn't have the say of how things are changed without everybody being at the table. And that's how we went about setting up the membership of the community. Further comments?
Really struggle with trying to Bruce Buchholz. I live south of 94, east of 29, north of 32nd Avenue. Just got through a special assessment on the arterial 32nd Avenue, development. Surprised the heck out of me. Been here 6 years, moved from Bismarck, and those 6 years have been assessed 3 different times with different projects. In this one, I questioned the scope of the special assessment district. It didn't seem like it, based on the policy, my interpretation probably differed from what the city said, but it doesn't seem like it went large enough so that it would probably have more people paying on the bill. Because I only live a couple blocks north, but it seemed like people farther north towards 94, I don't believe were touched by the assessment. Initially, when I looked at it, they weren't. Okay, they were?
The north boundary of that was
94, okay. Because when I looked at the assessment district initially, so that was good, I heard that change. I didn't go south, I guess, to Fleet Farm, which most of the traffic, I think, uses that intersection to get to Fleet Farm. But Fleet Farm was closer to 40th. But so I guess my point is, it seemed like the policy should be, I feel, should be interpreted a little more friendly so it includes a larger area if possible. Or, because that bill was a tough one. It doesn't make a difference what you call a special assessment. It's still money out of my pocket. And you can call it a tax, you can call it whatever, but it's tough. Thank you.
Dan, did you want to have any follow-up and additional perspective? I'm assuming that 2 of you have talked?
I believe so.
Yeah. Another thing, I guess I talked to a number of people down there and into the business guys. The guy that owns Fargo Implement, I think he was being assessed $140,000 on his land. And for that individual to come up with $140,000, if he had a 10% margin on his equipment, he has to sell over $1 million worth of equipment to pay for that. So I think from the business perspective, I don't know if the city really looks at that, because how they affect the businesses in those areas.
Well, first to answer the question about the bands, we set them up as fairly as we can. Typically, again, halfway to the next band or a half mile on either side. The band we're talking about for 32nd Avenue to the north, where you're at, is an extremely large area compared to the south. Because as you stated, Fleet Farm is in the 40th Avenue band, not the 32nd Avenue, because they happen to be about just shy of halfway on the other side. As far as commercial versus single family versus multiple, they're also capped. In some commercials and I know the property you're talking about, they have direct fronting on 32nd Avenue, but their lot is large enough where they also have some indirect benefit. And we base that on a formula that we use to keep it as fair and as equal and as consistent as possible.
Additional comments? The last slide before the mayor takes the podium. What could we do different? Transparency, communication? I was just going to call on you because, in your experience, I'm sure you have some ideas.
This one, because of the process I went through, I know you put it in the Monday Fargo form. You try and list that in advance. The map, you can't even read it with a magnifying glass, so, and I don't know how, I appreciate doing that, but it seems like that information should be shared better, and I don't know what's the easiest way to do that, but the map is probably a start, but it seemed like, like I say, you can't read, what streets and what's there. So, I don't know how to do that. send out or letters or whatever. That's probably the only way, because not everybody's got internet, I guess, to some degree. I know, especially as a senior citizen, I know a lot of people that don't. So,
Good point. Ty, you got that noted? Brenda, do you have a comment?
So I would say, so when we do create our special assessment districts, we do send out letters. And so we do a mailing with a letter talking about the project and a map. So if you're not getting the regular mail, any other ideas of how we can get that information out to people? Because I know those are things we always are up against, because we also have areas that are renters. And so we really rely on those owners to get that information onto the renters. And so those are things of how do we get into the social media and try and get that information out. Our hope is, as we move towards a 4-year CIP, that we can try and get that out more so you can see what is coming ahead and what may be impacting you down the road.
Other ideas, comments? Just to wrap up before Mayor Mahoney takes the podium here, just as kind of a recap, the information received tonight as well as Tuesday night will be cataloged alongside the task force report and list of recommendations. I expect that probably the second meeting in July, the City Commission will take that information and have a discussion at City Commission level with no action, and more public input from a standpoint of what we're doing and how we're debating that at City Commission. And then likely 2 weeks after, the recommendations will come from that list of effort from tonight, Tuesday, and the task force, then will be acted into amending the policy moving into the year 2020 for the fiscal year for the city. So that's just kind of a timeline of what I expect will happen when we move this through. So I really appreciate the feedback and the insight tonight, everyone's participation, and now I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Mahoney.
Thank you. First of all, if we could just give a round of applause to all the people that were on the Special Assessment Committee. I would like all the hard work and all the efforts to do. Second of all, to answer your question just a little bit about how we do get the information out, I do think we have to do a website. We also have to ask people if they want something written, because it is hard to understand at times. Just going back to what Cosgrove talked about, is we used to have 245 main breaks in the winter. We're now down to 45. Our streets are assessed at a grading of 78. What 78 means is most of the time your streets are in pretty good shape. And the community has made this decision that we want infrastructure taken care of, so we do that. Third item is the way you can help keep specials down is bring a lot of relatives and friends into town and have them spend a lot of money. Because we have a 1-cent sales tax that helps bring that down. And 40% of that 1-cent sales tax is funded by people not living in Fargo. So bring West Fargo people over too as well. But what's happened is that they've gone through everything, and I think the message is loud and clear to the Specials Committee is arterials are a problem, and we need to relook at that. Whether we have to fund more of it or not fund more of it, I think the city has to truly look at that. The other thing that came about was they're working all these 10 months, the legislative body passed a law, and in that law they're going to give us money for infrastructure. And that infrastructure money they're going to give to us has to be used on infrastructure. The committee could decide that what we should do is take some of that Prairie Dog Fund money and help bring down the cost of infrastructure in our houses. And I've been on the commission for a while, but what happened in 2014 when Sanford built their big building, we had $1 billion worth of work in town of construction. So what do you think happened to concrete costs? What happened to everything? And we talk about cap costs. Your costs didn't go up with inflation or didn't go up with anything because you had cap costs. The city still had to pay more. And at that time, the engineers came to us and said, let's rethink this. Maybe the homeowners can take a little more. And it was really at 70-30. So at 70-30, but now all of a sudden the cost went up. It cost the city even more to pay for the extra specials. That new policy was a failure. It did not work. It just did not work because it didn't bring in all the different things in the cap costs into it. So what happened is the pricing went 50-50. Well, people were seeing things of $16,000 for specials versus $8,000. That was way too much. So now we're back to the commission had voted. We went back to the old policy, which actually we have less complaints about in that particular policy. We think with the Prairie Dog funding, we can continue to bring down specials even more for the homeowner. It might be 80-20. It just depends how much money they have in that. One thing I would suggest is make sure the census gets done right, because if the census gets done right, the state even has to put more money into that funding for us. And that theoretically could be 13 million a year, which is really, it's a lot of money that helps us out. The sales tax is 24 million a year. We do on rehab specials, or we do on specials yearly, about $28 to $30 million a year. So if we have ways of funding it better, it should make it better for the people in the community. So we look at arterials. We talked about the administrative fee of 1%. There's only 2 cities in the state that do 1%. So we're one of them. We will relook at that, but what Ken talked about, if I can only give you $25 at the end, and you probably won't own your home at 25 years, you'll be, well, I'm going to give it to somebody in the future. We take the money and put that back in the infrastructure. We just put it right back to take care of infrastructure. So there's no extra, we don't get piles of money that comes back out of the special fund. So that's kind of that. Can you help the developers? Can I help Dan a little bit and bring my engineering fee down 1%, or bring my administrative fee down 1%? Will that be passed on to the homeowner? And that's a question I think people have to wrestle down a little bit. But we have some options of things we can do for the community. So, and I appreciate your discussion about what specials do for us, as far as it is your own home, your own area that you're doing it. And if we don't do it that way, we have to find the money somewhere else. So that's always the question. Do you want higher property taxes? Do you want higher utilities? I think not. I think you want us to keep those as low as possible. And that's really what that sales tax is funded for. So I leave it to the recommendations that we'll get as a commission, and we'll try to wrestle that ground. I would ask any of you who didn't feel comfortable standing up here if you'd give us comments so we understand what's going on. And just Arlette, one of the questions on density you asked about, what's happening is the 80-foot lots aren't selling, the 40-foot lots aren't selling. We're looking at stuff now that is like the Bison Meadows, which is 40 to 30-foot lots is basically what's selling. Does it cost us more or less to take care of less density? We need to increase our density. And we're going to eventually run out of land for the city of Fargo. As we know, we're going to be landlocked. So we'd like to do as much density as possible. The latest planning plat that I looked at, rather than 4 units an area, are up to 7 units an area. And it's not going to all be big apartments. It's going to be more of a mixed neighborhood that has more density. But you know, we have a hard time doing infrastructure because if you put a big apartment building in North Fargo, a lot of people don't like that either. So it's kind of a balance of how much density we do. But thank you very much. You were very patient this evening, and hope you were educated on specials and everything about them now. But everything we can do to try to bring those down, we'll continue to try to do. So thank you.